Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Today I am going to discuss the very beneficial economic effects that I anticipate would stem from indefinite human life extension. Now, before I am met with the common objections, let me describe the scenario that I'm actually going to be discussing. This kind of indefinite life extension can only be achieved by attaining the indefinite youthfulness of human beings. That is to say, that if people live indefinitely, they're not going to live indefinitely in a frail, decaying, senescent state, because for the most part, it is that frail, decaying, senescent state that ultimately results in death, and in the meantime, results in much greater susceptibility to disease. So there's one objection to indefinite life extension that we can get rid of right from the starting point. It's the idea that if people's lifespans become lengthened dramatically, they will be in this senescent state for much longer, and that's going to burden the healthcare system. It's going to be tremendously expensive. It is also going to burden all of the so-called retirement security systems that Western governments have set up, such as the Social Security system in the United States and various other pension systems in Canada and in Europe. Well, if we have indefinite human longevity, we also have indefinite human youthfulness, and quite the contrary, that's going to greatly unburden the medical system, and that's going to greatly unburden the government-provided pension systems to the point of rendering them all completely unnecessary from anyone's standpoint. If indefinite youthfulness is achieved via indefinite life extension, then people in the mainstream will also recognize that these pension systems are no longer necessary. If you have the health and vigor of a 25-year-old, then you do not need Social Security. You do not need Medicare or any other kind of subsidized health insurance. You can accumulate your own resources and pay your own way to whatever standard of living you desire, as well as whatever health care you will need. And there will, of course, still be health care in that system, the kind of health care that is necessary to maintain one's body, to periodically rejuvenate it, to perform research into combating an ever larger array of diseases, and of course to stop these diseases at a very early stage. With the kind of technology that can bring about indefinite longevity, it will also be possible to diagnose certain harmful diseases much earlier. For instance, it might be possible to diagnose a cancer several years before significant tumors are formed, and therefore a cancer could be caught so early that it would never pose a significant risk to a person's life. That would be one necessary large component in achieving indefinite life extension, but really what will happen is a large number of medical advances, each in a particular field targeting a particular disease or delaying a particular condition of old age. All of these will come together and make it possible for people to be biologically younger much longer without this necessary upper limit that exists during our time. So, to understand how that will in reality affect the economic situation of the world, we need to understand the concept of time preference. Time preference can be understood fairly simply with the following illustration. I think all of us, when we're offered the choice to have $100 today or $100 exactly a year from now, will choose $100 today. These are equal satisfactions, unless the world dramatically changes exactly 1 year from now. But let's say that the state of the world is relatively predictable, and you know that $100 a year from now will buy about as much as $100 today. I think you will prefer $100 today. But what if you were offered a choice of $100 today versus $101 a year from now, effectively a 1% annual interest rate? What would you choose? Would you take the $100 right now and spend them? Or would you defer that gratification for that extra dollar 1 year from now? Now, of course, a 1% interest rate is quite pathetic, at least compared to historical interest rates that have been paid, but that's about what you will get with a bank savings account today. Is it worth it for you to put $100 in the bank right now and prevent yourself from having the use of that for a year in order to get that extra dollar? And different people will answer that question differently. Some people will say, no, it's not worth it for me. I need to get $105 a year from now. Some people will say, no, that's quite good. It's more than worth it for me. I would even be happy with $100.50 a year from now. These kinds of differences can be called differences in a person's rate of time preference. To what extent does a person prefer present satisfactions to future satisfactions? Or another way of putting it is, to what extent does a person discount future satisfactions? So someone who would be willing to have $101 a year from now or $100.50, not as much of a difference from what he could get today, but would still be willing to defer that gratification, could be considered to have a lower rate of time preference. That person is more willing to put off a present satisfaction for a future gain. Someone who insists on a much higher future gain in order to put off a present satisfaction can be considered to have a high rate of time preference. So if someone says, I would rather take $100 today unless I can get $200 or more a year from now, that's an extremely high rate of time preference. Essentially, this person would need to be paid an effective annual interest rate of 100% in order to be willing to defer the gratification of having those resources for a year. Now, the rate of time preference of an individual is determined by a variety of factors. And really, it's not possible to tidily enumerate them all. Some of them have to do with the particular individual's character and particular tastes and preferences and enjoyments that that individual would like. But I think one great aspect that definitely plays a role in time preference is the individual's time horizon. To what extent does the individual see his future as stretching onward? To what extent does that individual take the future into account when making decisions? And to what extent does that individual think that it's even worthwhile to plan for the future? So, as an extreme example, let's say a given individual is a terminal cancer patient and he's told he has 6 months to live, and nobody in his condition had yet survived past that 6-month time frame. So how will he behave? Let's say he has a fair amount of money, no heirs to whom he would wish to delegate that money after his death. That individual would be very motivated to spend that money on shorter-term kinds of enjoyments, essentially to try to get as much use out of it while he can, because in 6 months, he's pretty sure that he will not be alive anymore. The exact opposite of that scenario is what would happen with indefinite human life extension, because now people's time horizons will become much longer. Most people today only think of their own futures in terms of the subsequent 50, 60, maybe, for the ones who are very future-oriented, 80 years. If they believe that they will live particularly long, or they're quite young, or they may even think in terms of the lifespans of their children, but not much farther beyond that. Some people might say, well, they're not just working for themselves, they're not just working for their children, they're not just making decisions taking that into account, they also value the well-being of future generations, even future generations whom they will never meet. I know that there's a lot of rhetoric that goes on to that effect, and probably some people at least are sincere in that rhetoric. However, to say that one values something like that in the abstract is not the same as to value something because it is directly going to impact one's own life. One can, of course, sympathize with the situation of what a future generation will be going through. But it is more remote. It is more of an abstract kind of consideration. And really, there's not that same kind of direct investment in that future state as there would be if one were actually living in that future state, and if one had a very strong and reasonable expectation of being able to live in that future state. So, if indefinite human life extension were to occur, people's rates of time preference, I think, would be greatly reduced. Their time preferences would become longer, which would imply more of a future orientation. There would be more of an orientation toward deferring gratification for much larger future rewards. Because, for instance, right now, if you are 20 years old and you have some money that you want to save for the future, at what point in time would you think, with your present life expectancy, it would be a good idea to withdraw that money and use it all up? Well, you're probably going to want to do that sometime within the next 50 years, just to be safe. You may live much longer than that, even given the state of present medical technology, but you also wouldn't want to spend it all in your very last few years of life. So probably by the time you're 70, you're going to want to have some sort of use and enjoyment of that money. But let's say you could reasonably expect to live to be 500. How long would you keep that money saved? How long would you keep investing it? And in the meantime, it would, of course, contribute to productive activities that other people would engage in. How long would you do that before you personally enjoy the accumulated rewards? Now, there are several implications to that, because I think most people in that situation would keep their money in a savings account or an investment account much longer. That means that more people will accumulate more capital and more resources for their own use, but also for the use of others during the meantime. So that is going to imply much greater wealth across the board. Furthermore, there's going to be another major effect. The longer you live, and the longer you are in a youthful, healthy, intellectually capable state, the more you will be able to learn. Indeed, right now, one of the biggest obstacles to learning among individuals is that life is just too short. There's not enough time to accumulate for most people, enough useful knowledge to know really well more than one or perhaps two particular disciplines. One of the results of that is a hyper-specialization that is somewhat stunting of progress, because one of the most important ways in which progress is done is by linking together knowledge from several distinct fields. So it's not just by narrowing in on one area and refining it in greater detail that progress gets made. It's when a fundamental insight from one area is brought into another area that a whole new avenue of discovery becomes available. And we've seen throughout history, every major industry that revolutionizes people's lives, for instance, information technology or biotechnology or nuclear physics, those industries become possible. They get formed when an insight from one field is brought and combined with another field. The longer people live, the more opportunities there will be for every individual to become a Renaissance man, to become familiar with a multiplicity of fields and to tie them together, to integrate them. Because the issue isn't so much a lack of knowledge diffused throughout the civilization, it's actually a lack of knowledge concentrated in particular individuals, all of whom could put it to good use, who know how the pieces fit together. And ultimately, it is desirable to have all of human knowledge interact in this integrated way, because we inhabit one reality, and all aspects of that reality are interrelated, even though in academic studies and in particular jobs, they get compartmentalized into disciplines and subdisciplines. A more integrated approach toward reality, but also an approach that doesn't neglect the details, is one that can bring about much more progress. At the same time, this kind of Renaissance man orientation will also be accompanied by greatly increased leisure. The entire concept of retirement, as it's known today, is going to change dramatically. I don't think that periods in which an individual doesn't do any paid work will go away altogether. Rather, what is likely to happen is that individuals will have serial careers. They will pursue one field for 20 or 30 years, then they'll take a break. They will pursue the next field for 20 or 30 years, and then they will take another break. And perhaps, in doing so, they will master multiple fields. They will be able to take something from their past careers into their subsequent careers. And as a result, they will not only have a much more varied and interesting work life, but they will also be much more productive in it. And furthermore, of course, the longer people live, the more leisure they will have in those intervening periods, as well as during the time that they are actually working. If they believe that they're going to have hundreds more years to pursue productive careers, they may not want to work to the point of stressing themselves out or wearing themselves down in a way. That often happens today because people feel like they don't have much time. People feel like, well, they have to fit in a certain amount of career accomplishment while their physical capacities still permit. If people lived indefinitely, that wouldn't be a concern anymore because they could rely on having those physical capacities for centuries to come. So perhaps the workday will be shorter. People will, of course, work much longer overall, during their lifetimes. And there will be more opportunities to take breaks. There will be more leisure, both during the periods when one is employed for pay and during those serial retirements, though there will probably be a different term by which they will become known. This greater opportunity for leisure will result in greater awareness of the richness of the world in other respects. Because during one's leisure time, one is one's own boss. One gets to direct one's own activities and choose what to pursue. I think that will result in people being much better rounded, which in turn, of course, will have positive feedback effects on how they think when they do work for pay and what insights they can apply to their careers. And I think in having this greater leisure, as well as this Renaissance man orientation, people will become a lot more cosmopolitan. They will see all of the variety of the world and all of the variety of people. They will get to sample it a lot more than most people do today. And that will give them a greater appreciation of those who are unlike them. That will give them a greater degree of tolerance and a greater willingness to share values and trade with people who are not like them. This will result in a more peaceful world. It will result in a richer world, certainly, because of the increased opportunities for exchange. Various atrocities born out of bigotry, for instance, racism or warfare, will greatly diminish and hopefully will disappear altogether. Because not only is there a much greater knowledge of people who are different, but there's also a much greater valuation of one's own life and of one's own future. Historically, people who have been willing to fight wars were people who were deprived, whose lives were very miserable, who didn't have a lot of economic opportunities, who didn't have a very long life expectancy, so they felt that they did not have much to lose. They might as well go out and try to conquer the neighboring tribe or the neighboring nation and steal their belongings, so as to have a slightly richer remaining few years of their lives. That was the enticement of warfare historically, and more recently there have been attempts to legitimize it by giving it an ideological motivation or a nationalistic motivation, but ultimately war is about people who are discontented trying to appropriate something through force because they don't feel like they have the leisure, the space, the opportunity to acquire those kinds of goods through peaceful means. That will go away. And more generally, there will be a greater valuation of individual human life. Because every time a life would be lost, more potential years of life would be lost. It's no longer that if a person dies in a car accident, that person could have lived for another 20 to 60 years. Rather, if a person dies in a car accident, that person could have lived for another 500 years or 1,000 years, or we don't know how long. So as a result, there will be a greater emphasis on physical safety. People will be much more reluctant to take the kinds of everyday risks that we take today just in order to live and to get around. Think about the daily commute to work in most places throughout the Western world. This is actually one of the most routinely dangerous activities to which people expose themselves. In the United States, 30 to 40,000 people every year die from automobile accidents. In a society where people live much longer, there's going to be a great deal of impetus to change that, to improve safety, so that these kinds of absolutely pointless deaths do not occur in the course of people routinely going about their own business. So there are several major changes that will happen. First of all, I think the whole structure of paid work will change. There will be more of a shift toward working remotely with technologies that are already available today, but will be much more powerful in that future. For instance, telecommuting, using the internet, using video conferencing, being able to work through a website as an independent contractor. People will be much more reluctant to get into a vehicle if they believe that there would be an accident. On the other hand, when they do travel, the vehicles they travel in will be much safer. For instance, there would be autonomous vehicles, cars that drive themselves. There are already tests of those vehicles being performed in various parts of the world. Google is testing them in California and in Nevada. There's a company in Germany that is testing autonomous vehicles, as well as a company in China. So the seeds of this kind of very beneficial change are already being sown. But because of the longer time preference, the greater future orientation, people will also become cognizant of risks that are routinely ignored today. So let's say your home is in a 100-year floodplain. That's an area that's determined, given the best knowledge that we have, to have about a 1 in 100 chance of flooding every year. That means that, on average, that area could be expected to have one flood every 100 years. Most people today living in that kind of area are not going to worry very much about flooding risk, because chances are they will not be alive by the time the flood happens. At least, while that's not a certainty, the probability of them dying before the flood gets to them is high enough that they will really discount that eventuality and not prepare for it particularly. Another example of this is with regard to earthquakes. There are a lot of areas of the world that are quite seismically active. Earthquakes of the kind that cause major damage to property and human lives are very infrequent, but when they do happen, they're very severe. The frequent earthquakes are the ones of lower magnitude, and they don't damage very much. So a person today, with today's life expectancy, can live in a seismically active area and never experience a major earthquake. So most people don't plan for that kind of eventuality. This is going to change with indefinite human life extension. And that change, while there will be an increased perception of risk, will actually be extremely beneficial in terms of addressing those risks that were previously largely neglected. There would be a much greater emphasis on both disaster prevention and disaster mitigation. A lot of science will be devoted toward how to make sure that natural disasters that have hitherto been considered beyond our control can be prevented. And this applies to a whole host of disasters. One could say the same about a tornado or a hurricane or an epidemic of the magnitude of the Spanish flu of 1918, which killed more people than all of the casualties of World War I. Most people do not factor preparation for those kinds of disasters into their day-to-day lives. But if they can expect to live for millennia, that will change. And it's not only these kinds of disasters which have been relatively routine within the larger time frame of human history. There are other, even greater possible disasters that thus far have occurred on a scale beyond the human scale. One such disaster would be an ice age. Ice ages have recurred rather frequently in prehistory. Every 100,000 years or so, there would be an ice age. And during the time of early humans, there was also an ice age that for a long time greatly stunted the ability of human civilization to thrive. It was only at the end of the latest ice age that the agricultural revolution could take effect, because finally there was enough arable land, enough land where there was a warm climate that's suitable to developing an advanced civilization. If another ice age were to happen within the next several thousand years or tens of thousands of years, how can it be prevented? That would be a big question that human beings who live indefinitely would have to face, and they would be personally invested in finding a solution. What about questions such as the long-term effects of waste and pollution, and how to dispose of those? Well, right now, nuclear power plants can produce waste that will be around for tens of thousands of years. Where do you put it? Right now, much of it is stored on the premises of the nuclear power plants. There have been attempts to deliver it somewhere else, for instance, the Yucca Mountain repository in Nevada, but those attempts have ultimately been shelved because there's not a lot of certainty about what really will happen to that waste on a time frame of tens of thousands of years. So people who live indefinitely are going to have to find a solution to how to dispose of these kinds of longer-term possible contaminants so that they don't pose a safety risk. Finally, there is a huge existential threat to human beings in the form of a meteor hitting the Earth. It's believed that the impact of an object from outer space was what resulted in the extinction of dinosaurs about 65 million years ago. Clearly, human civilization is not immune from a similar impact. These are events that are extremely infrequent, but also colossally severe. Human beings who live indefinitely would have a greater probability of encountering such impacts and would have a greater impetus of developing technology that could deflect an asteroid or a meteor or a comet that was headed toward the Earth. And there could be even an economic motive in doing that. For instance, instead of just deflecting and redirecting an asteroid, why not try to capture the asteroid and harvest its minerals? There would be more time, and there would also be more incentive for these individuals to develop those technologies. It would be easier with indefinite longevity to develop those technologies than it is today, because the same people would continue to be around. Instead of people dying and passing their knowledge on to the next generation, that knowledge could continue to accumulate within the same human beings. This is much more efficient, because even though there is civilizational progress every generation, so much gets lost in transmission. So many skills do not get passed on. For a variety of reasons, not everyone has the opportunity to teach someone else. Some people might die before they have that chance, even if they're willing. And furthermore, every short-lived human today has limited time and a limited mental capacity, so even if someone from a subsequent generation wanted to learn from a previous generation, there's only so much that person could learn. So it's very important that these problems be addressed, and for the sake of the survival of the entire human species, that they be addressed by individuals who live long enough to be able to collect within themselves all the pieces from a variety of disciplines that will be necessary to solve huge existential threats, like the possibility of an object from space colliding with the Earth. A longer-term project that really ought to interest human beings who live indefinitely will be space colonization. Finding other habitats for human beings. While human beings are stuck on this one planet, they remain immensely vulnerable. Any calamity of sufficient size could wipe out the entire species or plunge it back into a dark age. An impact from an object such as a large enough meteor would do it. A planetary nuclear war would do it. A sufficiently devastating epidemic, say taking the Spanish flu and magnifying its destructiveness by a power of 10, which is certainly conceivable, would do it. So, as long as humanity remains confined to one planet, there's this risk of losing everything that our civilization has so far achieved. With indefinite human life extension, there would be hundreds of years to deliberate about what is the best way to populate other worlds. It would be an immensely time-consuming process because flying into outer space requires tremendous expenditures of energy. And with the technology we have today, for instance, with a space shuttle, it would take millions of years, literally, to travel to a different star system. What could be possible solutions? Well, some attempts might involve terraforming nearby planets, for instance, terraforming Mars. A longer range attempt would be to actually send a crew of humans to a habitable world in another star system. With the recent Kepler telescope deployed by NASA, some candidate habitable worlds are beginning to be identified, and surely with future technology there would be much more accurate and frequent identification of these kinds of habitable worlds. And this is a project that currently cannot be accomplished within the typical human lifetime. It would take hundreds of years to realize the kind of space colonization that I'm describing, setting up viable human habitats in other places in the solar system, as well as throughout the galaxy. That's going to be actually a harder problem than the problem of preserving our own bodies from disease, decay, and death. But if we can manage to preserve our own bodies from disease, decay, and death, that would certainly help toward solving this greater challenge of space colonization. On a more local level, there's going to be a reorientation of consumer demand. Again, because of the longer time horizons, the lower rate of time preference, consumers are going to want more durable goods, goods that can last much longer, hundreds of years, as well as goods that are more of an investment type of good rather than an immediate consumption type of good. An investment type of good, or a capital good, is a good that can produce other goods, essentially. And sometimes the distinction between an investment good and a consumption good is blurred because much of it depends on what you use it for. For instance, your computer is an investment good to the extent that you can create other goods with it. You can create works of writing, art, music. However, it can also be a consumption good if you use it to, for instance, play a computer game. Now, at the same time, it can be both a consumption good and an investment good if what you're doing is both for your own enjoyment as well as to create goods that are useful for other people. So the distinction is fuzzy, but what we will see less of in a society of people who live indefinitely is the kind of splurging consumption that shows no regard for the next day. Of course, most of you are familiar with the old saying, "Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die." That was the attitude of many people with resources, historically, especially when life expectancy was much shorter, because that's all they could do. If they had wealth even, they didn't know how long they were going to live. Even the kings and aristocrats would often die very early in their lives, in their 30s and 40s, from debilitating diseases that medicine at that time could do nothing about. So in prior eras, particularly before the Industrial Revolution, one would frequently see this kind of bizarre combination of extreme opulence on the part of some people, on the one hand, and squalor and misery on the part of most, on the other, existing side by side. And most often, the people who had resources didn't particularly care about alleviating the plight of those who were suffering, because they didn't think it would do very much good. Honestly, if they could have a feast and spend all of their wealth on luxuries just to enjoy them for a few years, that would be the best life they could expect to have. Right now, with some degree of life extension, certainly substantial since the Industrial Revolution, one sees a lot more of an orientation in human beings toward philanthropy, toward establishing a world where one doesn't just enjoy oneself, one provides for the future for oneself and for other people. There's a lot more charitable giving among the wealthy today than there was among the aristocrats of old. Why is that? Because it's believed that this is an investment in one's own future as well. I think there would be a great extension of that trend the longer human beings live. Because ultimately, if I'm going to be around for the next 500 or 1,000 years, there would be a much greater interest from my point of view that other people also be well educated, that other people also be comfortable so that they're in a position to go beyond mere subsistence and innovate and develop some of those solutions that will ultimately be necessary to save humankind from the great existential threats. As a result, people who live much longer are also going to look outward much more. And in how they spend their money, they're going to spend it less on conspicuous consumption, and they're going to spend it more on investing in the future for themselves and for other people as well. So that, in essence, is my understanding of the economic effects of future indefinite human life extension. I think not only will those effects be immensely positive, but it is necessary for us to bring about those effects in order for the entirety of human civilization to have a chance against the kinds of perils that, on a much larger time scale, occur routinely throughout the universe, and that, if human civilization stagnates at its present level, would leave us as sitting ducks. Seriously, it is time to progress to a point where human beings can confront these challenges. But to do that, we all need to live long enough for these challenges to be part of our time horizons. That's just one reason why living longer is so important. Thank you very much. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I was asked recently to consider what the implications would be for crime and the criminal justice system if indefinite human life extension were achieved, and if human beings began to live much longer than they do today without an upper bound on their life expectancies. First, I think crime in general would decline dramatically. One of the fundamental motivations for crime is acquisition of material prosperity, where the criminal perceives that there are not legitimate ways of doing so, or the criminal perceives himself to be at a competitive disadvantage in pursuing prosperity legitimately. Now, I understand that's not the motivation for all crimes, but it is for many. So, with indefinite human life extension, humans are going to have many more opportunities to achieve prosperity. And failure at one of them, or fear of failure at one of them even, is not going to be as much of a deterrent to prudent planning for the future, and planning with a much longer time horizon. If you have several hundred or several thousand years in which you anticipate to be alive, it would cost you much more to break the law now and get punished for it, or to infringe on someone's rights and get punished for it, than it would if you had a much lower life expectancy. At the same time, the consequences of financial failure in a legitimate enterprise are much less ruinous, because you have a lot more time to try to rebuild your fortunes after that. Essentially, if you have an enterprise that failed, or an occupation where you didn't succeed and may have even incurred financial losses, you have many more years to try again, to try to rebuild that or try to pursue something else. And you have those opportunities legitimately without having to resort to crime. Furthermore, a big reason why crime would decline is that the valuation placed on an individual human life would increase greatly. If, for instance, a murderer takes a human life, that's no longer depriving a person of 20 to 60 years of future life. It would be a deprivation of an indefinite amount of future life, perhaps 500 years or 1,000 years or even more. So it would be seen as a much more heinous act to do that. And as a result, I think many people will form far more internal inhibitions from committing crime than they do at present. Right now, at least for a sizable minority of people, there are only two external inhibitions from committing crime. One of them is the law and the fear of punishment. Another one is essentially a kind of religious fear, a fear of punishment from an external cosmic enforcer, from a god. And it is a bit scary to live in this kind of world, where one knows that a sizable percentage of one's fellow human beings do not rule out the infringement of other individuals' rights or the use of violent force categorically, that they rule it out only because of external deterrence. However, I think that value system will change with indefinite human life extension. It will change because every time there's a death, so much more will be lost. And the consequences of that are going to be perceived much more starkly. Right now, if a person dies, it is seen as a tragedy in most circumstances, but death is so prevalent, so ubiquitous throughout the world, that it's just seen as one among a huge number of tragedies, and it becomes eventually a statistic. However, when death, especially death from murder, becomes the exception rather than the rule, when the rule is that human beings live and keep on living happily and prosperously, and very few really terrible things will happen to them in the course of their continued indefinite lives, then those exceptions are going to be much, much more noticed. And there's going to be a lot more outrage about it. And that outrage is going to create cultural change toward how crime is perceived, how murder and theft and mutilation and rape are perceived. Because you're taking away a lot more with those crimes from a person who lives indefinitely than from a person who today has a fairly strict upper bound on his or her life expectancy. Now, with that being said, it's not entirely clear how this would affect criminal punishment. It could go one of several ways. On the one hand, it could be thought that because this criminal act is so terrible, especially with regard to the worst crimes, with regard to murder, because a murder takes so much of a person's life, it will be seen as deserving of higher punishments than exist today. However, there's another side to that coin, and that is certain punishments, such as imprisonment today, would have a much greater impact if the person who is punished also lives indefinitely. So if a person gets life in prison, it's no longer 20 to 60 years of prison time. It would be an indefinite amount of prison time, especially if it's life in prison without the possibility of parole. A legitimate question could arise as to whether there would be a death penalty in a society where there is indefinite human life extension. Now, on the one hand, some people might argue, well, that's only fair, because this person took away so much from another human being that this person doesn't deserve to be alive either, and at the very least, this person's life expectancy needs to be shortened. Now, what form would that death penalty take, if it even exists, is an open question. Perhaps the so-called death penalty in that society wouldn't be execution, which can be fairly brutal and can also, in many cases, target the wrong person. There may instead be a decision not to subject that person to artificial life-extending treatments. So the so-called death penalty might just be deprivation of that person of the fruits of medical progress. So that person would still have his life expectancy as it would be today, but he wouldn't get life extension therapies. That might be the form that a, quote, death penalty takes in that future society. And what it could achieve in that form is, first of all, a fairer appeals process, where just because the executioner got to the person before a court stayed the execution, that wouldn't result in the possible taking of an innocent life. Instead, there would be a much longer time period to determine true guilt or innocence. And second, it could do away with a lot of the costs of execution today. One little-known statistic is that it actually costs more these days to execute someone on death row than to keep that person in prison for the rest of his or her life. And there are many reasons for that. The execution techniques are part of that. The various bureaucracies that surround the imposition of the death penalty are another part of that. The costs of protracted appeals, of course, are a part of that. But I think many people would hold the view that having those appeals is a necessary safeguard to ensure that an innocent person isn't wrongfully put to death. So with regard to the death penalty itself, I'm quite ambivalent in its present form. I'm ambivalent about whether it's possible to have enough confidence in condemning a person to death and knowing that that person is actually guilty of the crime. There have been cases where DNA evidence has exonerated people many decades after the fact of the crime. But I'm also very wary of having governments in their present form have the power of life or death over their own citizens, because we have seen time and again how that power has been abused and directed toward people who are entirely innocent. But in an environment of indefinite life extension, maybe there could be a workaround around this issue. After all, there are some heinous criminals, and just because medical science will have progressed, that will not eliminate all of those criminals. So if someone commits horrific atrocities, horrific rape murders, or serial killings, I think a legitimate argument could be made that that person deserves death. It's a question of how will that death occur? And perhaps the approach that I outlined previously, where the death penalty in this future society will be deprivation from life extension therapies, and essentially allowing that person to live the pre-indefinite life extension human lifespan, probably in prison or in another venue where that person is separated from the rest of society. That could be a humane solution, but that could also be an effective way to get rid of these criminals and to punish them for what they had done. Because think about it, if that person's life expectancy is 80, but everyone else has an average life expectancy of 1,000, this kind of so-called death penalty would deprive that person of more than 9/10 of his or her life expectancy that would otherwise be the case. That would be a great deterrent from murder. With regard to other crimes, once again, there would be fewer of them, but I think in a society where there is indefinite life extension, there would be more of a focus toward restitution. The idea is, if you stole something from someone, or if you injured someone in a certain way, there would be more opportunities to repair that damage. One, because of medical science, say, in treating injuries that are currently irreversible. And two, because of economic progress. So it would be faster and easier to undo economic damage or financial damage. So let's say someone is guilty of reckless behavior that injures another human being. And let's say, for this particular illustration, it's not a civil wrong, but a criminal wrong, because with a civil wrong, it would still be, even in today's environment, a matter of paying restitution. But let's say it's a criminal wrong. Let's say this person was a gang member who pulled a knife on another individual and really did some damage. Damage that would be irreparable and would have paralyzed that individual today, but in this future society could be repaired through medical science. So then, it becomes less sensible to imprison that individual for a long period of time. It becomes more sensible to put that individual to work and garnish his or her earnings to pay for the treatment for that injury, even if it's a criminal wrong. Right now, there is the stark division in the criminal justice system where, for a civil wrong, the civil justice system does something entirely different. It's focused mostly on damages and restitution, whether it's economic restitution or non-economic restitution in the form of pain and suffering damages. But the criminal justice system sees the wrong as being committed not against the person, but against the entire society. And so there are punishments that are set by statute, that if you commit a crime of this sort, you will get a sentence in prison ranging from this number of years to this number of years, or you will get a fine of a certain amount, irrespective of what the actual damage was. And I think the reason why this arose in large part, without attributing any cynical motivations to anyone, is that many crimes have irreparable consequences, particularly when you consider injury or death. And with those crimes, it's very difficult to put a monetary amount on the damage that was inflicted. So there's a kind of proxy for that now in terms of time spent in prison. But what if in the future, based on technological and economic progress, it becomes possible to repair more of that damage? Well, that's going to change how it is seen. There's going to be much more focus on actually repairing that damage and perhaps going above and beyond that and compensating for other aspects of the suffering that was inflicted. And there would be a move away from this idea of just serving time because of a crime against, quote, society in general. So those are my thoughts on how indefinite life extension could affect crime and the criminal justice system. By no means is this the only possible interpretation, and I've had to do a bit of thinking myself to figure out which way it would go in situations where it seemed ambiguous. So by all means, I invite you, if you have different thoughts, different expectations, to voice your ideas as well, because I would be quite interested to see and hear them. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I have been asked recently to comment on what would happen to religion if human beings lived indefinitely. And, of course, I think this is an important question to address because one of the principal elements of any mainstream religion is the proposition that some sort of life, some sort of existence occurs after death, whether it be in a Western monotheistic tradition where there is a heaven or sometimes a hell, or in an Oriental tradition where there could be reincarnation into another life form in this world. So I think one of the reasons why that idea of essentially life after death arose in so many religions that developed practically independently of one another, is that human beings, ever since there was a human species, have been tremendously afraid of death. And rightfully so. It would be the cessation of their own individual existences. So it would be very psychologically comforting for them to find some idea to latch onto that would say that, look, death is not the end of one's own individuality. It would be comforting because it would mean that there would be less to fear about death. And it's interesting because many of these religions have posited afterlives, be it in heaven or as a reincarnated being, that could, at the very least, be much better than one's life in the present world. So if you are a good Christian, you might go to heaven, or according to the Calvinists, if you're one of God's elect, you might go to heaven. If you are a virtuous Hindu, you might get reincarnated into a member of a higher caste with more privileges in your life. And this is intended in part by the advocates of these religions as motivation for virtuous behavior in this world. And this goes to the second role that religion has played throughout most of human history, and that is as a force to maintain certain kinds of behaviors which are considered by those religions to be virtuous. They're not always virtuous by any stretch of the imagination, but in a more cynical light, they can be seen as maintaining the existing social order. The religious framework, which uses tactics that are emotionally appealing to many people, is employed by the ruling elite, whether it be a political class or a class of priests, as existed in many early civilizations, to maintain and support their own power, so that people's ideas of what is virtuous conduct, what is good conduct, hinge on adhering to certain, not just metaphysical beliefs, but certain practices designed to bring them this reward after death. And while they're seeking this reward that will come after death, in this life, they do the bidding of the elites who control the religion. This has been the case for religion for most of human history, but not all. in societies where there's religious freedom, most notably in the United States, which was one of the first to enshrine religious freedom as part of its Constitution, as part of its Bill of Rights in the First Amendment, this tendency for religion to achieve social order diminishes in scope. There's still some of that residual voluntary compliance with religious teachings, but they become much more diverse. There are many more different sects of Christianity in the United States now than existed in continental Europe during the time of the wars of religion in the 1500s and the 1600s. And these literally thousands of religious sects are able to coexist relatively peacefully with one another. Of course, there are occasional flame wars and very unflattering characterizations of one sect by another, some of them deserved, some of them not deserved. But we don't have the massive religious slaughters that existed back during a time in the pre-modern era where a particular set of religious beliefs was seen as the guarantor of social order. And if you deviated from that set of beliefs, if you were a heretic, if you had a different religious viewpoint, even if it's a very slight variation from the predominant one, you could be seen as a threat to the power of the ruling elites. Well, that function of religion has really diminished over time. There are some forces, some religious fundamentalist lobbies that are trying to resurrect that in this country, and it's very alarming. However, it is not nearly as strong as it was circa 1650, either in continental Europe or in the United States and Puritan Massachusetts. So there has been some progress made. So just as we have seen that the role of religion as guarantor of a particular social order and protector of a particular group of entrenched elites has diminished, the other role of religion as a comfort mechanism for people to deal with the eventuality of their own deaths can diminish as well as human life expectancy increases and as death comes to be seen as just a possibility rather than an inevitability. I don't think that any time in the foreseeable future all death would be avoidable altogether. Even if medical technology were able to greatly extend human life, there could still be accidents and natural disasters that could take human lives. I think it would increase humans' awareness of these perils and get humans working much harder than they have been up to now in alleviating them, but still they would exist. Death would still be a possibility. But the mindset that prevails would no longer be, how do I get the best outcome for myself after death, according to the framework of whatever religion I happen to adhere to? Rather, it will be, how can I avoid death? How can I make the best possible life for myself here, in this world? Because death is no longer nearly as scary as it was in the past, in the sense that it can be avoided, rather than it has to be met head-on. It has to be experienced by every human being. So, in that sense, I think the allure of religious thinking will diminish. I'm not saying, however, that religion will disappear altogether. If there's one aspect of religions that can be observed to be universally true, is how remarkably adaptable religions are. That is, a religion isn't just a set of ideas that gets passed down from generation to generation unchanging. One expression that I frequently like to use is religions evolve. And I know this flies in the face of what a lot of fundamentalist Christians in the United States think. But if even those people consider their own Christianity as compared to, for instance, the Christianity of St. Augustine or Thomas Aquinas, surely there would be significant doctrinal differences between them and those earlier Christians. So religions evolve. And religions evolve based on factors other than religious doctrine. They evolve based on the societal and economic and cultural environments in which they find themselves. And what can change a societal, economic, or cultural environment more than this lifting of the upper bound on human life expectancy? Surely there would be a tremendous effect on people's worldviews when the technological possibilities will change. Some religions will resist it. Some religions, because their doctrine has become akin to dogma, will wish to stagnate the world in order for their doctrine to remain appealing to their followers. But that's going to be a losing battle. It might, unfortunately, be a battle that delays the advent of needed treatments for a generation or two, which would be extremely tragic. But in the long run, I think, those reactionary forces are going to be defeated. Just as, for instance, in the struggle to abolish slavery, many mainstream religious denominations were against abolition. They were against abolition, and they had biblical arguments to back it up. They were saying, well, if slavery is so wrong, then why does the Bible prescribe so many different rules about the treatment of slaves? Clearly, the Bible condones slavery, and I think the Bible actually does condone slavery. But eventually, these religions got dragged by the march of progress, and I think primarily by the influence of the 18th century Enlightenment, into changing their positions on slavery. And sure, there were some radical religious sects that were already out of the mainstream, such as the Quakers and certain other northern Protestant sects that were abolitionists very early on. But without the secular philosophical influence of the 18th century Enlightenment, as well as the accomplishments of the Industrial Revolution, which had its intellectual roots in the Enlightenment, but which as its consequence had the complete obsolescence of slave labor as a reliable mode of production. Without those influences, slavery might still exist today, and most religious denominations, except those Quakers and other minorities out there, would still endorse it as reasonable. I don't think religion is really an animating force in many eras of human history. Rather, it's a force that kind of lags behind as a barometer of what the culture was a generation ago. And with regard to how that can change, remember that religions are practiced by people too, and they're overseen by people. The hierarchy of priests or pastors or rabbis or imams in a particular religion, all of that is comprised of human beings who live in the world even if they claim not to be of the world. And they see changes in technology, they see changes in economic realities and the economic opportunities that their very followers have. And they have to struggle to stay relevant. And if their theology ceases to be relevant to their followers, they lose attendance, they lose financial backing, and so they have to adapt. With indefinite life extension, the changes will be radical, and likewise the theological adaptations that many religions will have to make will be radical. I'll just give an example. Christianity teaches that there will be a resurrection and a last judgment. What many people don't understand, even many Christians don't understand, that I as an atheist actually do understand, is Christian theology states that the resurrection isn't going to be in some ethereal other world, like a Platonic world of forms. That's actually a corrupted understanding of Christianity that arose out of its blending with Platonism. Rather, the resurrection would be in the flesh. So how is this for a take on Christian theology? What if, in an era of indefinite life extension, when the idea of an afterlife is not going to be nearly as lucrative to as many people, the focus on resurrection in the flesh would be taken a bit more literally, as in figuring out how to essentially reconstruct human beings who have lived before and try somehow to approximate as best as we can their biological makeup and even maybe their memories in the past. A kind of combination of the goal of mind uploading with the goal of indefinite life extension. What if certain branches of Christianity form that start seeing this as the meaning of the resurrection? And what if the meaning of the Last Judgment would be every person who is resurrected gets called to account for his or her decisions prior to the resurrection? Wouldn't that be an interesting twist on Christianity? Now, of course, with the doctrinal specifics, I don't know exactly how that would be accomplished. I don't know which people would be more receptive to it and which people would resist it, and in which religions and in which sects of which religions it will occur. But it's definitely something that has to occur with any major technological advance in order for the religion to maintain its relevance. They'll try to squirm their way out of it and say that somehow it was really all consistent all along. But they would only be able to do that because of the fickleness of human memory. I have heard certain Christians tell me, literally, that they believe the exact same things that Christians in the early 3rd century believed. Now, they may want to think they believe those exact same things, but maybe that's because they haven't read enough of those early 3rd century Christians to really have an informed opinion about that. But clearly, I would prefer the company of most of today's Christians to the company of most 3rd century Christians any day. Because those people today have absorbed many more valid moral norms than their early Christian predecessors have. The only conclusion that's left to me is that the source of those moral norms is not Christianity, it's something else. Something that has happened in between the 3rd century and today. I happen to think it's the 18th century Enlightenment and its philosophical successor movements. So with that being said, the future of religion is clearly in the hands of individual human beings. And people ultimately have the choice to look at reality in a certain way or to look at it in a different way. What they focus on will affect what their beliefs turn out to be. And I'm not saying necessarily that people can will themselves to believe absolutely anything or everything, though the Jesuits in the 16th century would have you believe that that is possible. What I'm saying is, by looking at particular aspects of reality to a greater extent than at others, one's conclusions and one's beliefs are shaped. Indefinite human life extension is going to introduce a very prominent other aspect of reality that people haven't looked at very much yet, and that's definitely going to affect their convictions, including their religious views. I think fewer people will be religious. The ones that are really going to have to change how they define their worldviews and their theologies and their systems of religious belief. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I was asked recently, how do I, as a transhumanist, deal with the second law of thermodynamics and its alleged implication of the eventual heat death of the universe and essentially the elimination of all complex systems within the universe, such as living human organisms. I am, of course, an advocate of indefinite human life extension, and for myself, I would like to live as long as possible. This questioner implied that there was some sort of necessary upper limit to how long that could occur, even with all of humankind's technological advances. And I have several layers of responses to this. The first layer of response will just address that argument on its face and ask a kind of so what question. Because even taking that theory at face value, that there will at one point in time be a heat death of the universe, that is a long ways off. A common estimate is that unless something else happens beforehand, this heat death of the universe would occur in 10 to the 100th power years. That is one Google. That is one with 100 zeros following it. Now, that's much longer than typical human lifespans are today. If I could expand my longevity from 80 to 90 years to one Google years, you bet I would take that, irrespective of what would happen at the end of that time interval. And this goes for much shorter time intervals as well. I'll take 150 years, I'll take 1,000 years, I'll take 1,000,000 years, if that is all that scientific progress can make available to me. More is better, of course, but if some sort of larger calamity occurs afterward, that is no reason to refrain from pursuing marginal or incremental expansions of one's life expectancy. I mean, does the fact that right now your life expectancy is in the 70s or 80s dissuade you from trying to live past 25 or 30? And of course, unless you're suicidal, it doesn't. You still want to live, even though there is a probability that your longevity will be limited in some way. So what I am advocating, and what transhumanists and other champions of indefinite life extension are advocating, is more is better. We want more. We don't know when it will end. Obviously, we don't even know if we will avoid some sort of fatal accident tomorrow, but we would like to, and we would like to exert our utmost efforts to get that longevity as high as possible. So that's the most direct response to that query. But I think we can be even more optimistic than that. Because, in my view, the hypothesis that all meaningful existence in the universe will end with this kind of heat death, where all energy throughout all of existence will become equalized and useless, essentially, is a misunderstanding of the strict meaning of the laws of thermodynamics. That is, there's a different way to look at it. And before we look at the second law of thermodynamics, I think it's fitting to start with the first law. I am not a physicist or a chemist, I'm a layman, but I am also a philosopher. And I think when looking at laws of physics or chemistry or any of the natural sciences, it's important to take them within their proper scope, not to take them beyond what they actually mean and construct some sorts of elaborate metaphysical theories from them that suggest that humankind, in its woeful and pathetically limited current state of knowledge, can predict the fate of all of existence one Google years from now. I certainly don't think that humankind, in its current age of barbarism, has attained that kind of prophetic ability. But we do know something. So the first law of thermodynamics posits that there is a conservation of energy, that energy is neither created nor destroyed. It does not come into or out of existence. Individual entities or systems can gain or lose energy. And, for instance, if energy is lost in the form of performing work, like you roll a boulder up a hill, that kind of energy can then be imparted to another entity. On the other hand, some energy is just dissipated as heat. It's lost, and as far as we know, it's absolutely useless for doing any further work on any other system. The second law, then, is one that says that when there is an isolated system, one that's not affected by other systems, the level of entropy or disorder within that system never decreases. So the system can only become more disorderly as an isolated system. It essentially loses useful energy. Energy dissipates out of it as heat. So if you have, say, a machine in a factory, and it runs on some sort of fuel, and you don't refuel it, you just let it keep running, it's going to lose some of that energy as heat. And the third law of thermodynamics, just to make a complete discussion here, says that the only time you have zero entropy in an isolated system is when that system is at absolute zero temperature. That's about negative 273 degrees Celsius. And absolute zero, exact absolute zero, is unattainable. So essentially what the three laws in combination suggest is that any isolated system left alone is going to experience an increase in entropy and disorder and a decrease in the ability to do useful work. But it's important to understand the limitations of this formulation. The limitation is that it pertains to an isolated system. That is to say, an external system can come into the picture and impart more energy onto that other system. So let's use the example of the machine in the factory. A worker can come in with a container of fuel and pour it into the machine, and the machine can keep on working. And even though all of the time that the machine is working, there is some heat that's dissipated, and it can't be captured as subsequent energy and can't be captured as subsequent fuel, that machine is not alone. And for as long as outside entities come in and do work on that machine, perform maintenance on it, put fuel into it, repair it when it breaks down, it can potentially continue indefinitely to do what it does. That's not a violation of the second law of thermodynamics. The mistake, in my view, of those who posit that the second law of thermodynamics requires a heat death of the universe, and this is a large contingent of individuals. It's a mainstream scientific hypothesis. I think it's an incorrect one, though, because it treats the universe as essentially a thing, an isolated, unitary system that is like that machine within the factory, except writ large. That, sure, you can have within the universe entities coming in from outside to put fuel in the machine, but the totality of all of these entities, the machine, the workers, the planets, the stars, that's got to, on net, increase in entropy, and eventually the outcome is going to be just essentially an even distribution of useless heat everywhere. I don't buy that because I don't buy the premise that the universe as a whole is comparable to a machine or a human organism or a planet or a star. The universe is not a thing. The term universe is just a convenient expression that people use. What it stands for is everything that exists. So it's a placeholder, in essence. We don't want to, whenever we make generalizations, enumerate a laundry list of, oh, here's this table, here's this chair, here am I, here's the planet Earth, here's the planet Mars, and we could go on and on listing trillions and quadrillions and any number, really, of entities, depending on how we describe them. So the term universe is really a time saver. We're just saying, look, I don't want to enumerate this laundry list of things, so I'm just going to refer to everything that exists. We don't know what the scope of that reference is. We have absolutely no idea what, if any, the limitations of that reference are, and in my view, there probably aren't any. In the sense that we do have observational tools, we have telescopes, we have spacecraft they've been able to give us some idea of a small chunk of existence, very small chunk. We know quite a lot about our planet, we know a bit about our solar system, we know a little bit about our galaxy. Just recently, there have been some amazing discoveries by the Kepler program of actual planets within other star systems, including planets that are very close to having the conditions where life could arise. So we're constantly finding out more. But we don't even know a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of what is it that this convenient reference of universe encompasses. So there's absolutely no reason to suggest that the universe is like this single machine at the factory, or like one of us, or even like one of our planets, or even like our solar system, in the sense that the second law of thermodynamics would apply equally to the entirety of everything that exists, as it would apply to a single entity in isolation, or a single system in isolation. To put it even more bluntly, we don't even know if it is possible to enumerate all of the entities that currently exist. Who says that we could put a number on it? Who says that the farther out we go, the farther out we explore the universe, we won't just keep finding more and more things, more and more stars and planets, or some other phenomena we don't entirely know about? All of the inferences, all of the hypotheses that have been made using current observation and currently available observational tools. So, to suggest a heat death of the universe, I think, is premature. And furthermore, given how scientific theories have been revised and in many senses improved upon over the course of humanity's very brief history, considering that the Ptolemaic model of the cosmos, which placed the Earth at the center of everything and posited that it was immovable and stationary, and the stars were just celestial objects comprised of a completely different material, though they wouldn't even have seen it as material, than the Earth. That was dominant even 500 years ago. Copernicus published his heliocentric model of the universe in 1543. Galileo was put on trial less than 500 years ago in 1633. And it was really only during the Age of Enlightenment in the 18th century that most people accepted that, no, the Earth isn't really the center of all of existence, that yes, the Earth does indeed revolve around the sun, and later on it was recognized that the sun also is not stationary, that entire galaxies are not stationary, that there's a whole lot of motion within the universe. And that's just correcting a very simple misconception that people had. So what would the state of our understanding of how celestial bodies behave be in 1,000 years? It would be amazing, to be sure, compared to where we are now. And I think our state of understanding the scope of existence, the breadth of existence, would be similarly improved. So I think the fallacy, to recap, of this idea that there is some inevitable heat death of the universe is the treatment of the universe in the same way that the objects that we encounter every day are treated, or even the large-scale objects that we observe, when really the term universe is a conversation saver. So with that in mind, I don't know if humankind is going to exist indefinitely. Obviously, I can't know because I cannot predict the future. Just like I do not know if I am going to exist indefinitely, but there are large-scale perils that loom on the horizon, on a much more proximate horizon than the proposed heat death of the universe. For instance, the Earth and the Sun would not be around indefinitely, according to the best scientific understanding, if we just allowed matters to proceed as they do now. Without human intervention, and hopefully by that time human civilization will still exist and be sufficiently advanced, the Earth has, maybe another 5 billion years of existence in store for it. That's much closer to us now than one Google years. So that's a problem that I think human beings need to put their minds to. But there are even more proximate problems. What about the possibility of an asteroid hitting the Earth and causing the sort of extinction that ended the Mesozoic era and the age of dinosaurs? That's an even more proximate problem. It could happen in 1 million years. It could happen even in 100 years. What about even more proximate problems? What about natural disasters? Major earthquakes, major hurricanes, major tornadoes. We've seen in 2011 how devastating those disasters can be. So how can we better predict them? How can we better prevent them? And how can we better mitigate the damage? What about the everyday problems that we face? The everyday killers of human beings? The myriad diseases that still haven't been cured? The wars by which human beings senselessly slaughter one another with absolutely no justification and no greater good, no matter what the rhetoric may suggest. There are so many biological problems, there are so many calamities, there are so many societal problems, and we can keep zooming in closer and closer to our own time to see just how many problems there are at every scale, and to see that this doesn't change anything in terms of our fundamental philosophical imperative to try to solve as many of those problems as we can, to try to extricate ourselves from as many of the perilous conditions that we're in, and to make life better. Because ultimately that's what transhumanism is all about. That's what humanism is also all about. It's about making human lives better. For you, for me, for everyone. So that is my response. That is why I am not concerned about what the second law of thermodynamics might spell for the universe 1 Google years from now. Thank you very much. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. As a proponent of attaining indefinite human longevity through the progress of medical science and technology, I am frequently asked to address key questions about the effects that indefinite life extension would have on human incentives, behaviors, and societies. Here I offer my outlook on what some of those impacts would be. The first commonly asked question is, what would be the benefits of life extension? The greatest benefit of life extension is the continued existence of the individual who remains alive. Each individual, apart from the worst criminals, has incalculable moral value, and is a universe of ideas, experiences, emotions, and memories. When a person dies, that entire universe is extinguished, and to the person who dies, everything is lost, and not even a memory remains. It is as if the individual never existed at all. This is the greatest possible loss, and should be averted if at all possible. The rest of us, of course, also lose the possible benefits and opportunities of interacting with that individual if he or she perishes. The second benefit is that people would be able to accomplish far more with longer lifespans. They could pursue multiple careers and multi-year personal projects, and could reliably accumulate enough resources to sustainably enjoy life. They could develop their intellectual, physical, and relational capabilities to the fullest. Furthermore, they would exhibit longer-term orientations, since they could expect to remain to live with the consequences of decisions many decades and centuries from now. I expect that a world of longer-lived individuals would involve far less pollution, corruption, fraud, hierarchical oppression, destruction of other species, and short-term exploitation of other humans. Prudence, foresight, and pursuit of respectful, symbiotic interactions would prevail. People would tend to live in more reflective, measured, and temperate ways, instead of seeking to haphazardly cram enjoyment and activity into the tiny slivers of life they have now. At the same time, they would also be more open to experimentation with new projects and ideas, since they would have more time to devote to such exploratory behaviors. The third benefit is that upon becoming adults, people would no longer live life in strict stages, and the normative societal expectations of what one should do with one's life at a particular stage would relax considerably. If a person at age 80 is biologically indistinguishable from a person at age 20, the strict generational divides of today would dissipate, allowing a much greater diversity of human interactions. People will tend to become more tolerant and cosmopolitan, having more time to explore other ways of living and to understand those who are different from them. The fourth benefit is that technological, scientific, and economic progress would accelerate rapidly because precious intellectual capital would not be lost to the ravages of death and disease. Longer-lived humans would be more likely to invest in projects that would materialize over the course of decades, including space travel and colonization, geoengineering and terraforming, prevention of asteroid impacts and other natural disasters, safe nuclear disarmament and disposal of nuclear waste, and long-term preservation of the human species. The focus of most intelligent people would shift from meeting quarterly or annual business earnings goals and toward time and resource-intensive projects that could avert existential dangers to humankind and also expand humanity's reach, knowledge, and benevolence. The achievement of significant life extension would inspire many intelligent people to try to solve other age-old problems instead of resigning to the perception of their inevitability. The fifth benefit is that major savings to healthcare systems, both private and governmental, would result if the largest expenses, which occur in the last years of life today in the attempt to fight a losing battle against the diseases of old age, are replaced by periodic and relatively inexpensive rejuvenation and maintenance treatments to forestall the advent of biological senescence altogether. Healthcare could truly become about the pursuit of sustainable good health instead of a last-ditch effort against the onslaught of diseases that accompanies old age today. Furthermore, the strain on public pensions would be alleviated as advanced age would cease to be a barrier to work. Another common question I am asked is, what drawbacks would life extension pose? I do not see true drawbacks to life extension. Certainly the world and all human societies would change significantly, and there would be some upheaval as old business models and ways of living are replaced by new ones. However, this has happened with every major technological advance in history, and in the end, the benefits far outweigh any transitional costs. For the people who remain alive, the avoidance of the greatest loss of all will be well worth it, and the human capacity for adaptation and growth in the face of new circumstances is and has always been remarkable. Furthermore, the continued presence of individuals from older generations would render this transition far more humane than any other throughout history. After all, entire generations would no longer be swept away by the ravages of time. They could persist and preserve their knowledge and experience as anchors during times of change. Every day, approximately 150,000 people die, and approximately 100,000 of them die from causes related to senescence. If those deaths can be averted, and the advent of indefinite life extension accelerated by even a few days, hundreds of thousands of irreplaceable individual universes would be preserved. This is worth paying even substantial costs, in my view, but fortunately I think the other economic and societal effects that accompany life extension would be overwhelmingly positive as well. As Death is Wrong, my illustrated children's book on the prospects for life extension points out, Death is the enemy of us all, to be fought with medicine, science, and technology. The book discusses the benefits of life extension in a language and format accessible to most children of ages 8 or older. Death is Wrong also outlines some common arguments against life extension and reasonable responses to them. For instance, I respond to the common overpopulation argument as follows. Human population is the highest it has ever been, and most people live far longer, healthier, more prosperous lives than their ancestors did when the Earth's population was hundreds of times smaller. Technology gives us far more food, energy, and living space than our ancestors had, and the growth in population only gives us more smart people, who can create even more technologies to benefit us all. Besides, humans ought to build more settlements on land, on water, underwater, and in space. Space travel could also save the human species if the Earth were hit by a massive asteroid that could wipe out complex life. I respond to the boredom argument by stating that due to human creativity and discovery, the number of possible pursuits increases far faster than the ability of any individual to pursue them. For instance, thousands more books are published every day than a single person could possibly read. A third question I am commonly asked is, would governments ban indefinite life extension if it is achieved? Once life-extending treatments are developed and publicly available, national governments would not be effectively able to ban them, since there will not be a single medicine or procedure that would accomplish indefinite lifespans. Rather, indefinite life extension would be achieved through a combination of treatments, beating back today's deadliest diseases, using techniques that would not be limited in their application to people who explicitly want to live longer. For instance, people who do not harbor that particular desire, but do want to get rid of cancer, heart disease, or Alzheimer's disease that may afflict them or their loved ones, would also benefit from the same treatments. These treatments would be as embedded in the healthcare systems of the future as over-the-counter drugs like aspirin and ibuprofen are today. It would be practically impossible to ban them, and countries that did would face massive black markets, or people traveling abroad to receive the same treatments. Furthermore, genuine healthy life extension would be a great fiscal solution for many welfare states today, which are finding themselves with unsustainable burdens pertaining to old age healthcare and pensions. The majority of healthcare costs are expended to keep frail people alive a little bit longer and to fight an expensive and ultimately losing battle against the diseases of old age. The only way dramatic life extension could occur is if regular and relatively inexpensive maintenance, made inexpensive through the exponential progress of information technologies and bio and nanotechnology, prevented the decline of the body to such a stage where expensive losing battles needed to be fought at all. Replacing the current extremely expensive end-of-life medical care with periodic rejuvenation and maintenance would be a great cost saver and may avert a major fiscal crisis. What concerns me is not governments banning life extension technologies once they are developed, but rather existing political systems and their associated politically connected established private institutions creating barriers to the emergence of those technologies in the first place. Most of those barriers are probably inadvertent. For instance, the FDA's approval process in the United States premised on a model of medicines and treatments that must focus on single diseases rather than the biological aging process as a whole. However, there have been influential so-called bioethicists, such as Leon Kass, Daniel Callahan, and Sherwin Nuland, who have explicitly and extensively spoken and written against healthy life extension. It is important to win the contest of ideas, so that public opinion does not give encouragement to the so-called bioconservative bioethicists who want to use the political process to perpetuate the old cycle of life, death, and decay, where each generation must be swept away by the ravages of senescence. We must stand for life and against age-old rationalizations of our own demise. Thank you very much.